A rebel leader in eastern Ukraine says the whole country is now a federal state of Russia. Is this a threat of an overzealous soldier, or is the Kremlin trying to send an ominous message? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Ukraine's rebels. It's a threat that puts a further wedge in Ukraine's peace deal. Rebel commander Alexander Zakharchenko blindsided lawmakers by declaring all of Ukraine Malorossia, or Little Russia. He went on to say Kiev could remain the country's cultural capital, while his own self-declared People's Republic of Donetsk would become the real seat of power. France and Germany were swift to condemn the move, while Ukraine's president called Zakharchenko nothing more than a puppet with the Kremlin pulling the strings. But within that insult is something that concerns international observers. If this indeed is a threat made by Vladimir Putin, is he trying to tell the world that his forces could try to take over the former Soviet Republic? Natalie Parhonen reports.
The self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine has taken a significant step forward in its separatist stance by declaring a new nation called Malorossia, or Little Russia, a successor to Ukraine.
We, representatives of regions of former Ukraine, offer to re-establish the state and in place of the former Ukraine, based on historical premises, to create the country of Malorossia. In this case, renaming the country is critically important, as Ukraine as a state is guilty of war crimes, mass terror and violence against its own people.
Russian President Vladimir Putin's spokesman says that statement was Zakharchenko's own personal initiative, and Moscow learnt about it from the press. But Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko says the pro-Russian separatists wouldn't have acted without the Kremlin knowing.
They are not political figures. They are Muppet shows, which translated and the messages they received from Russia.
The declaration from Donetsk may be on paper, but it's part of the ongoing crossfire in the conflict, which has seen Russian-backed separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk try to break away from Ukraine. The Kremlin says it's committed to the 2015 Minsk II peace agreement signed by Russia, Ukraine, Germany and France. It's meant to deliver a full bilateral ceasefire on both sides before a political solution is reached. The creation of Little Russia would be a direct violation of the deal, which is meant to reinstate full Ukrainian sovereignty. The war has now claimed more than 10,000 lives since it began in 2014. And this latest escalation between Kiev and Russian-backed rebels in Ukraine's east appears to be making the prospect of a reunited and peaceful nation a much more distant reality. Natalie Parhonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New York is Andrei Dobryansky. He's an executive board member of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. And from Moscow, Leonid Safin. He's a chief editor at Geopolitica and the Journal of Eurasian Affairs. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Andrei, this Alexander Zakharchenko, is he a nobody or is he somebody whose words you're taking seriously?
Both he and his words are nothing to take seriously. He is a puppet, as the Ukrainian president pointed out. He can be replaced at an instant from Putin's words. That's how the power vertical works. The structures throughout Russia or the territories it controls come directly from the Kremlin, and anything that a lower peon says, such as Zakharchenko, means nothing in the scope of the world. This is not a major declaration, but a PR stunt made to give them some attention while Ukraine has been winning this war for several months.
Okay, Leonid, is Ukraine winning the war, and this is why Putin's trying to send a message through Zakharchenko, as Andrei sees it?
I think we need to see this message like a multi-layer attempt to see from historical point of view, from symbolical point of view, and to enlarge frame of current discussion about future of the Ukraine. Because the situation there is very bad, and ceasefire not stopped and Kiev not follows Minsk agreement. So it's some kind of rebranding of the process. In 2014, for example, there was project of Novorossiya that is similar like Malorossiya. And now we see it's attempt to bring more attention what happens there exactly in Lugansk People Republic, in Donetsk People Republic. It's not depends of Moscow. I think it depends more on people in the region and what happens there.
Okay, but Leonid, you said something interesting because you started off with, I think this message means. So I'm interested to hear your perspective. Do you believe that this was actually from the Kremlin? Because the Kremlin says, hey, we had nothing to do with this. We read about it in the papers. We don't know what's going on. Nothing to do with us in the peace process. Do you agree that this was actually a message from the Kremlin and that they're lying about having nothing to do with it?
I think it is a very high kind of art to understand political intentions, and maybe Mr. Zakharchenko to understand ideas of Mr. Putin, for example, and he just to speak something that Mr. Putin thinks. But I cannot, for example, to speak about ideas from the Putin's brain. And maybe Mr. Zakharchenko can do it, I don't know.
No, but I mean, it's very clear. I just want to ask you if you think Moscow was sending that message rather than just Mr. Zakharchenko on his own.
No. I think Moscow not deal with this kind of message. Moscow act in more direct way. For example, real political negotiation, like in Minsk, for example, and like we do it in Syria with the United States and with Turkey and with Iran.
Okay, Andrei, do you agree with that?
I think that it's obvious that this comes from Putin. This is happening at the same time that the Russian forces are mobilizing the largest war games that they have since Soviet times, mobilizing militarized armored divisions of tanks up against the Russian border in a manner that hasn't been seen since the Cold War. This attempt in Ukraine, this little PR stunt, is just another facet of trying to scare the West in getting a better negotiation deal by Mr. Putin.
Leonid, is this a tactic to scare the West?
I think from American point of view, Russia is some kind of aggressor. But from Russian point of view, we just would like to defend itself. And any kind of military drills on the Russian territory or in any border, for example, in Kaliningrad and Sklav, it's our domestic right to do what we would like to do. And United States, for example, to use European partners and just to conduct Atlantic resolve maneuvers already for 2 years in European countries. So yes, it's kind of time of a Cold War that we just try to defend itself and defend our people. And from United States point of view, we just to continue our behavior. Maybe it's not normal for Washington, but from Moscow point of view, it's normal, and some kind of attacks and some kinds of actions in Syria, in Ukraine, and already organized coup in Ukraine from Washington and Brussels with assistance of Washington politicians. It's not normal.
Okay.
So we have two different points of view.
This is laughable,
politics.
Imran.
Come in, Andrei.
This is laughable to call Russia a friend and not the aggressor when it has military forces on several countries outside of its borders. You don't have to go to 2 territories in Ukraine where there's an armored and military occupation of Ukrainian territory. You can go next door to Georgia, where there is also 2 territories with a military invasion and still occupied to this day in contravention to any peace deal that was signed afterwards. Same thing with Moldova, same thing with Azerbaijan. The list goes on and on and on. And what kind of a peaceful nation decides to shoot down an innocent jetliner? We have 3 years now since MH17 was shot down by a Russian rocket, and still nothing has happened from that. That is not the action of a peaceful nation.
Okay, so Leonid, that's not defensive, that's aggressive.
Ukrainian side not confirmed that Russian military troops were presented in Ukraine anytime. He just to provide some kind of rhetoric, no any facts, no any confirmations that Russian troops were in Ukraine territory. But besides some kind of very loud words about sovereignty and that Russia just organized aggression against Ukraine, for example, I would like to remind Kosovo precedent. Where is the sovereignty right of Yugoslavia, for example, when the United States supported Albanian terrorists in Kosovo?
That's a good point.
It's
yeah, but this is the thing. You're not debating anybody who brought up Kosovo. Andrei didn't bring up Kosovo, right? So we're talking about Ukraine's sovereignty here. They feel that you're trying to swallow up half their country in the east, and you have swallowed up and annexed Crimea and are trying to establish facts on the ground and borderization. So Kosovo argument aside, you would understand why a Ukrainian nationalist would see, even if there aren't any Russian troops in their country, even if we grant you that it is clear that Moscow is arming and funding pro-Moscow separatists in the east. You'd agree with that, right, Leonid?
International rights based on precedent. So we need to remember Kosovo, what happens there. We also can to remember Cuba, for example, and Guantanamo Bay still occupied by American forces. If you will speak about Ukraine, that from point of view that Ukrainian nation is friendly nation to Russians, we just would like to protect people there in Donetsk and Lugansk Republic. So it's a reason why Russia to provide, for example, humanitarian assistance to there and would like to stop what happens there.
Okay. Yep. Interesting point. Certainly point. Yeah, okay, let me bring in Andrei, because Andrei, this is interesting. I just want to talk about Crimea for a second as an example of the rest of the conflict, right? So Russia annexes Crimea. Nobody recognizes that annexation except for 6 countries: Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Syria, North Korea, and curiously Afghanistan, but that's something to go in a little bit later on. Nobody recognizes it, yet it still continues. Nobody's willing to do anything about it, even though they don't recognize it. With that in mind, are you prepared psychologically? Are you willing to accept that at some point these facts on the ground will be exactly that, facts on the ground, and the east of Ukraine will be Russian?
Right. The West does not accept this. Ukraine does not accept this. It's not just all those almost 200 countries that don't accept this false annexation, illegal annexation of Crimea, except for that small smattering you talked about. It's also every single international institution does not accept that. No banking institution will recognize any transactions done in Crimea. You cannot send a mail because international postal regulations will not send something directly to Crimea.
But Andrei, nobody's done anything about it.
You cannot land a plane because the International Aviation Found. I'm saying that this is how much it's not recognized. So the fact that you're saying that at some point we need to recognize a de facto status, that's not how the rest of the world exists and functions. And frankly, the fact that the UN Charter has been violated in such a gross way demands that some action happen. We understand that the United Nations Security Council has been stymied by the veto of Russia to do something further. But the fact that the sanctions still remain and continue to remain must mean something in the international community. And we also cannot forget the plight of the indigenous peoples and the human rights abuses that are happening in Crimea day by day. Human rights monitors are denied access to critical areas of Crimea. We cannot get relief for, again, the indigenous peoples who are being wiped off Crimea, their language, their culture. They don't even have the right to assemble anymore in Crimea. That's not something that the rest of the world is ready to stomach at this point.
Right. Leonid, let me ask you, do you want for the rest of the east of Ukraine what's happening in Crimea?
I think not only east of Ukraine, but many regions would like to join with Russia. It's because not only situation there is very worse in Ukraine itself, but because half of Ukraine, there is Russian population. They speak Russian language, and conflict started just because Ukrainian nationalists started repressions against the people who already have Russian identity. There is a right of people to protect itself. It's market in
certainly, Leonid.
Charter of United
You brought
Nations.
up Kosovo, so let me then bring in another historical analogy. Hitler did that with the Sudetenland. He said, those people, they speak German. They're not in our country, but they're German. They have German identity. They speak German, so I'm going to go and swallow it up. Isn't it the same?
No, I think we need to see every case separated. For example, many nations, recognized nations, there is not people who speak only one language, for example. In Poland, we can find the different kind of ethnic groups. In Germany, we can find different ethnic groups. And in the United States, of course, there are Spanish language people and English language people. And I think it's kind of melting pot in the United States. And there is a problem with the international institution itself, because it's mostly based on Western paradigm, and the main conductor there is United States.
Okay, but you say there's a problem. It's interesting that you say there's a problem with international institutions, but it's Russia's veto on the UN Security Council that prevents anything from happening when people want to do something about Crimea and the war in the Donbass. Let me move this forward a little bit now and ask you, Andrei, about the status quo. I've been reading some of the OSCE reports. It seems as if every day there's a ceasefire violation, and sometimes it's the Ukrainians, sometimes, or a lot of the time, it's the rebels in the east. Is it, I guess, Andrei, maybe normal for Russia to expect the status quo to go on, given that they don't have to pay so much of a price? And what does that mean for Ukraine then, Andrei?
Well, there are many prices being paid by Russia and by Ukraine. You mentioned the violations. You can just talk about what happened overnight. Grad rockets, tank fire, artillery being fired on Ukrainian positions, and 4 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in the last 24 hours. That follows on a soldier who was shot by a sniper the day before. Russia's violations keep on going day by day, which is why nobody can agree to a ceasefire with Russia, because we know they're going to fire increasingly. However, what Russia has learned is that Russia's forces, Russia's actual soldiers who have been captured, and they are in Ukrainian television every day because there are so many Russian commanders on Ukraine's territory trying to get more and more of Ukraine, but they cannot do that. They haven't been successful since they tried their push in 2014. And Ukraine's army, within a matter of months, was able to stop them. They have not been, Russia has not been able to go forward since that time, and Ukraine's army has only gotten stronger and stronger. So the fact that Ukraine has continued to modernize itself, continue to increase the force of its army, which is now the largest army within Europe, the fact that this modern country now has a visa-free regime can even be demonstrated by Zakharchenko's own words, where he says that he wants to declare his own country, and yet he would like a visa-free regime that Ukraine has negotiated with Europe. Perhaps it is the Russians who would like to live in Ukraine, where there's a little bit more freedom. And perhaps it's Russia which denies people the right of their own language, wherein the main library of Ukrainian culture in Moscow was shut down. There are no Ukrainian schools that are able to operate within Russia, even though that's the largest of our diasporas with over 1 million Ukrainians living in Russia. We're not allowed our own schools. We're not allowed our own libraries. That's where people are being repressed because of their ethnicity. It's not in Ukraine.
Okay, Leonid, that was a lot. It was passionate. It was very strong. Surely you must accept some of that?
Actually, I not see problem with Ukrainians in Russia, and many labor migrants working there, and also many refugees there from Ukraine going to Russia to live. So Russia to provide assistance like peaceful nation, like you told. Problem is we can back to the year of coup, because it was organized by the West in Russia. In the United States and European Union responsible for this coup. They invested a lot of billions of dollars just to organize different kind of group who started this operation in Kyiv and other cities. And of course, we need to remember 2004 when started first Orange Revolution. This was also idea, I think it's idea fix of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who told that Ukraine must be engaged by the West. It will be some kind of future belt of European security.
Okay.
But it is fake.
So,
and,
okay, but that's what you believe.
Ukrainian
that's what you believe
media
as the
provide
background.
fake news about
But
Russia.
surely, Leonid, that's what you believe as the background. Opinions differ about what happened at Maidan, what happened in terms of people's intentions. But would you accept that someone like Andrei is not a puppet of the West? He's a Ukrainian who is proud of his country and doesn't want to be under the boot of Russia. Can Andrei, as a patriotic, nationalistic Ukrainian, exist in your eyes?
I think it's will of Ukrainian people what to do next, and Russia will not intervene. If Ukraine would like to join European Union, no problem, why not? It depends of Ukrainian people. But problem is that political elite now controlled by West, and they not follow will of people. And in Ukrainian constitution, we can read that Ukrainian power based on the people. So it's violation of Ukrainian constitution itself.
Okay.
So it's a main problem what happens there in Ukraine.
Okay, Andrei, very finally, next week, representatives of Ukraine, Russia and the separatists meeting in Minsk. Can anything good come out of that, given the facts on the ground, given that everybody so fundamentally differs on where to go next in this conflict? Are you optimistic at all, Andrei?
I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of why should we be optimistic if it's the same people coming to the table, if it's the same situation on the ground, basically. I would say that Ukraine keeps bettering its army, keeps integrating itself every day more and more with the West. Ukraine has been, deployed on NATO missions for 20 years now. So it's a much more Western-focused country. It's a much more Western-focused economy. It's been bouncing back in terms of its own power. And really, it's on Russia now to figure out what its course is going to be. They have a presidential election coming next year. It's on Russia to demonstrate an openness to international monitors, to show an openness to maybe having a free press, which it's not allowed to have. It should be on Russia's table now to prove itself to want to be a member of the international community, because it's not a Western conspiracy when over 190 nations see that Russia has been violating territorial integrity of other countries. Small island states are not part of the Western alliance or conspiracy. Okay. This is the rest of the world acknowledging that there is one troubled area, and that is the presidency of Vladimir Putin.
Okay, Andrei and Leonid, it's been good to talk. I've got to wrap. Thank you very much for joining us. Still ahead, protests against Poland's ruling party. Are Polish leaders trying to take over the country's Supreme Court? And the White House says Iran is holding up its part of the nuclear deal. So why did the US Senate pass new sanctions? Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Thousands of Poles surrounded the presidential palace in Warsaw on Wednesday, outraged over their government's attempt to take over the country's judiciary. Parliament has passed a bill that will sack all of the justices on the Supreme Court and have them replaced with judges handpicked by the Justice Minister. The government has already sharply curtailed the power of the courts, and EU officials say they might be forced to levy sanctions if Poland's checks and balances erode any further. Yvette McCullough has more.
A nighttime vigil in protest of judicial reform, seen as the latest in a string of assaults against Poland's democracy and rule of law.
We came to fight for free courts for us and for our children, because what is happening now is a scandal and a disgrace.
One group of people is imposing their will on others. They want to give themselves power to have influence on everything.
Under the bill, all 83 Supreme Court judges will be immediately dismissed, except for those chosen by the Justice Minister. Supreme Court judges will also be obligated to consider Christian values in rulings. The National Council of Judiciary will still appoint future judges, But under another bill that was passed last week, but also not yet signed into law, Parliament would effectively assume control of the council, with 15 out of the 25 members chosen by the lower chamber of Parliament. The Polish government says these reforms are necessary to make the courts more accountable and rid them of corruption and post-communist elites. But political opponents see it as a power grab.
Until the late President Lech Kaczynski was around, you did not have the courage to raise your hand at the judiciary, because luckily there was someone around who understood what separation of powers is about.
I know you're afraid of truth, but do not wipe away your treacherous muzzles with my brother's name. You destroyed him, you murdered him, you are knaves.
Poland is now at risk of raising the ire of the European Union. It had called for the government to put these reforms on hold or face disciplinary action.
Each individual law, if adopted, would seriously erode the independence of the Polish judiciary. Collectively, they would abolish any remaining judicial independence.
This comes amid other concerns about the Conservative Populist Party's apparent crackdown on media freedom and civil liberties since it came to power. The EU says it's now very close to triggering Article 7 for the first time. This would see Poland stripped of its voting rights, and the EU says it may consider sanctions too. But triggering Article 7 requires the support of all EU member states, and Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban would likely veto any action against Poland. Will these reforms help to hold Poland's judiciary to account, or rid it of its independence? And now that Parliament has approved them, will the EU make good on its threats? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's go to our panel, who are both in Warsaw. First, Marek Matraszek. He's a political consultant in Central Europe. And Elżbieta Korolczuk. She's a human rights activist and a researcher at Sorbotten University. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Elżbieta, if I can begin with you, thousands of Polish people have taken to the streets. They're not happy. They're protesting. Tell me why you're against this move by the government.
Basically, it's an assault, full-front assault on Polish constitution and Polish democracy. You cannot have a functioning democracy without judiciary system which is independent from politicians. And these three pieces of legislation, which are being either accepted right now in the parliament or have been accepted during the last couple of days, make judiciary from the Supreme Court to every average court in Polish cities dependent on politicians. And this is something which is extremely dangerous, because if politicians can choose judges, how can we believe that judiciary is truly independent?
Elżbieta, do you not trust the politicians to choose the right judges at all?
No, I don't. I don't think anyone can trust politicians in that. There is a system which is called checks and balances, and which actually makes it, which is a basis of democracy, which allows the politicians to be under the surveillance of the law, just as every citizen. And that's how it should function. We cannot trust the politicians to be, wonderful and good at all times. That's why we need Supreme Court. That's why we need Constitutional Tribunal. That's why we need courts to actually check them, to actually make sure that everything is done in accordance to law.
Okay, so Marek, is this government eroding the checks and balances that were in place in the Polish government?
Well, first of all, it's very important to remember that the issue of judicial reform and reform of the court system in Poland was a key plank of the election agenda of the ruling Law and Justice Party, which gained an absolute majority in the Polish parliament for the first time that's ever happened in over 25 years in the Polish democratic system. So judicial reform was very much accepted by the electorate. And in fact, there's been an opinion poll which came out just a few minutes ago showing the ruling party very much in the lead on 38% against the opposition on 19%. So the principle of judicial reform has always been very important for this government, reflecting a great deal of frustration on the part of many ordinary people about the inefficiencies of the judicial and court system in Poland. And one of the key reasons for this reform is really to try and shake up the judicial system, make it more accountable, and get rid of some of the bureaucracy that is endemic in the Polish judicial system. So this is not a move which is unpopular in the country. It's certainly unpopular with the opposition, right, but that's to be expected.
Okay. And Elżbieta, now, after all the debate, given that it has been passed, how do you feel about that?
I feel saddened, and I feel really anxious about the future of Polish democracy. Unfortunately, there is this discourse in Poland, which is also propagated by the ruling Law and Justice, which says we have won the elections, and that's why we can do whatever we want to. And you know, the democracy is not about the brute power of majority. Democracy is about individual rights, it's about minority rights, it's about deliberation, it's about respecting those who might be in opposition. And this reform will actually be something that will destroy the independence of the judiciary system and will do nothing about the problems that we are facing now, such as bureaucracy in the judiciary and so on. Okay. So this is just sizing the power. This is not reforming the system.
Interesting point there, Marek. What she's saying is, sure, there's a democratic mandate, but there's different types of democracy. And now, clearly, in her opinion, Poland's moving away from a liberal democracy to an illiberal democracy. Isn't that a fair point?
Well, I think the Law and Justice Party and Mr. Kaczynski have never concealed their desire to shift the balance of power within Poland. One of the main criticisms of the chairman of the Law and Justice Party, and in fact the whole Polish government, is that the judicial system and the judiciary in Poland have never really been depoliticized. The judiciary, after the anti-communist revolution of 1989, was never really purged of former communist judges, many of whom are still in position. And they've taken a very strong position in defending their corporatist interests. So this is a move seen as shaking up the judicial system. Yeah. The other important thing to remember, also over the last few days, there have been some important amendments to the proposed legislation. So, for example, the Minister of Justice no longer has the right to choose judges to the Supreme Court. That's been vested now in the National Judiciary Council. And the principle of electing judges to the National Judiciary Council has already been amended in a way which makes it impossible for the ruling party to control that process. There have been a lot of amendments in answer to some of these criticisms. And do bear in mind, of course, that in other judicial systems, whether it's in Europe or the United States, the executive does have significant influence over the choice of judges. So this reform doesn't really make Poland that much different from other judicial systems in Europe or the United States.
But I guess what Elżbieta is trying to say is that she sees a trend here, right? But Marek, let me go back to Elżbieta. I'm not going to ask you, Elżbieta, if you feel that those amendments were good enough for you, because you're well aware of the amendments, and yet you're still on this program telling me you're not happy with this. I want to pick up on something that Marek said. He mentioned corporatist interests, right? It reminds me a little bit of in the United States when President Trump, as a candidate, had spoken about draining the swamp, right? And I want to point to what the Justice Minister had said very recently. He said, we want to end corporatism and introduce the oxygen of democracy there, because Poland is a democracy based on the rule of law. This is not courtocracy, said Zbigniew Ziobro, the Justice Minister. Elżbieta, what do you say to that?
Basically, I think that we should stick to truth and facts and not opinions that some people might have. Because the opinion that some people have that this is a swamp that needs to be drained doesn't really meet the facts. Because there is research which shows that Poland is not so bad, doing not so bad in terms of, the time that you need to wait for the ruling, which is in the middle. Poland is in the middle of the European countries. And also Poland is not doing so bad in terms of corruption among the judges and so on. So there is no really need for purge, as my interlocutor said. There is a need for a good reform, which will make this area, these institutions, less dependent on politicians and not more dependent as it is now. As to the question and the issue of, the communist legacy, I would like to point to the fact that in common courts, over 70% of judges are 40 years or younger. So they actually never lived their professional lives during communist times. So this kind of discourse is selling well, but it doesn't really reflect the reality.
Okay.
And again, as we see what's happening now, I don't really see in what ways this reform would actually end, waiting lines or would make this whole system less bureaucratic. It will only make it much more dependent on the Minister of Justice, who is also the Prosecutor General already, and on the whole, on the people who are in power now. So this is always a bad sign.
One good point there, among many, Marek, that many of these judges are really young. They had nothing to do with the communist legacy. Why is that being used as a stick to beat them with?
Well, that's not my view. That's the view of the ruling Law and Justice Party. I make no comment on that. But I have to say that the view that the judiciary has been apolitical over the last 25 years is a total fiction. There was a phrase in the 1990s when there were definitely, most of the judges were of a communist background. And frankly, every government that's been in power since 1989 has been able to exert political influence over the judiciary. That was just as much the case with the previous post-communist governments of the 90s and the 2000s, the previous civic platform government, and the reform that merged the position of the Minister of Justice and the prosecutor was in fact a reform of the previous government. So the fiction, it is a fiction to say that the judges are politically neutral. They've been very pliant in the past to political pressure, and Law and Justice have made no secret of that. They are much more illiberal than previous governments. They do see themselves as being aligned with Donald Trump, and they look to Viktor Orban in Hungary as also a model. And this is a model of politics which has gained support in Poland. And that's something that's undeniable, and they won't deny it. And as I say, some of the changes that were made in the laws over the last few days at the request of the Polish president, I think goes some way to moderating some of the criticisms that needs to be levied. Of course, there is an issue of to what extent these reforms will not open the door for more avenues of political pressure, but that's nothing different to what's been happening in Poland the last 25 years. Much of the judiciary has been politicized for a long time.
Let me ask you, Elżbieta, let me broaden it out to Europe, because we are running out of time. I wanted you to respond to that, but I want to kind of talk about Europe for the moment. France and Germany are not happy. I've got quote after quote from the Council of Europe's Human Rights Commissioner, from the European Parliament's EPP leader, all not happy at this direction where the politicians are getting to pick the judges. So it sounds as if Europe is threatening Poland. Do you want those threats to be serious, or are you happy with them? Let me ask Elżbieta, Marek. Elżbieta, do you want those threats to be serious or hollow?
I think that either we are treating democracy seriously and Poland's accession to the European Union, or this is just piece of paper that we sign and nobody cares. If you are treating this seriously, there should be consequences for not following the rules that we all agreed with. And Poles and Poland also agreed to those rules and signed those agreements. So either we are treating this in whole seriousness or not. And as to what has been said before about, the bureaucracy and the corruption among the political corruption among the Polish judiciary, I mean, how can you explain this reform in light of those information, because this is making things worse, not better. So you don't treat flu with cholera or other, serious deadly disease. This doesn't make sense.
Okay, Elżbieta, let me ask you, isn't there a bit of a conundrum here? Because if you want consequences, and if Brussels decides to crack down on Poland, doesn't that only strengthen the Law and Justice Party? Doesn't it only strengthen the populism and the nationalism, where they can say, look at those guys from the outside, they want to change our country, they want to change our values. So doesn't that make it worse?
I am not sure about this, because most Poles are fans of the European Union, and Poland is one of the countries in which the accession to the European Union was accepted with the highest number of people who are pro-European Union. So European Union and belonging to the West, basically, is something important for Poles. So I think that this should be made clear, that what the Law and Justice does is to draw away Poland from the European Union, from the connection with the Western countries, and towards Russia, basically, because, I mean, with our geopolitical position, there is nowhere else to go. So in that sense, we have to make clear that what the current government does is to leave Poland at the mercy of Russia. That's basically what it comes down to.
Marek, is that what Law and Justice is doing? Leaving Poland at the mercy of Russia and gambling with its EU future?
The Law and Justice government is...
Yes, it is.
Well, the Law and Justice government is probably one of the most anti-Russian governments in Europe. In fact, they're working very hard within the European Union, the European Commission, to counter Russian influence in the region, especially on energy issues.
No, it isn't.
And I think they will be making, the foreign minister this morning has already said they will be making a very vigorous case for the Poland. A lot of what is being said in Brussels is actually fundamentally misinformation. The politicians are not going to be selecting judges in Poland. That is simply not true, and I do ask you to correct that. There's a reform of the system of the National Judicial Council plays the selection of judges. Judges will be selected by the National Judicial Council. There will be more political oversight than an administrative sense of
let me explain this, Marek. Marek, let me explain it then. So the politicians choose the National Judicial Council that chooses the judges. So essentially the politicians choose who chooses the judges.
Exactly
yes?
What
the
will
National
happen.
Judicial Council is made up of 35 individuals, 15 of whom are judges, and the 15 judges on the National Judicial Council will have to be selected by a 3/5 majority in Parliament. The government does not have a 3/5 majority, so there will have to be political compromise. There will be greater democratic oversight over the selection of judges. Judges will remain judges, and they will remain responsible to the law.
Elżbieta?
Not really, because actually one piece of legislation that is being discussed now is about the National Council of Judiciary, which will basically come down to the politicians choosing the judges. And another piece of legislation about the highest court, about the Supreme Court, actually allows Mr. Ziobro, who is now the Prosecutor General and the Minister of Justice, to basically sack the current judges and appoint their nominees. And they already sized the Constitutional Tribunal.
That's not true.
There is no institution now.
That's not true. The terms of office of the judges
that would be able to oppose the power.
And that's
exactly why they needed the Constitutional Tribunal to, to take over the Constitutional Tribunal, because the Constitutional Tribunal, if it wouldn't be under the influence of the Law and Justice now, they would obviously they would say that this is unconstitutional. You can read the Constitution, it's very clear.
Okay, we're out of time, so I'm going to give Marek 20 seconds to respond to that final point. Marek?
I think there's a lot of misinformation about what's going. It's a very nuanced political argument, a very nuanced argument about the role of judges and politicians. There's a balanced debate here in Poland. And I think people need to take a long, hard look at this legislation and see, is this legislation radically different from any other legislation which is either in Europe, in Germany, in the United States. It's not. It's very similar to other models of the relationship between the executive and the judiciary. Poland is doing nothing out of the ordinary in these reforms.
That's not true.
I've got a wrap.
I beg to differ.
Okay,
yes,
clearly you two disagree, but I'm glad we've given this conversation the platform to hear both sides. It's been great to have both of you on. Marek and Elżbieta, thank you very much for joining us.
Iran remains, and we all know this, one of the most dangerous threats to the United States, not only our interests here around the world, but also to regional stability. And I've got a whole list of things that we can go over here that Iran is responsible for.
What a difference a day makes in U.S. foreign policy towards Iran. 24 hours after the White House said Tehran had been keeping up its side of the nuclear deal, the government turned around and slapped Iranians with new sanctions. The U.S. Treasury Department has blacklisted 18 people and entities for a number of alleged offenses. They include supporting Iran's military, accusing them of trying to develop an illegal weapons program, and harassing U.S. naval vessels. Critics say the sanctions are harsh and is a ploy by Donald Trump, who once promised to rip up the Iranian nuclear deal, then decided not to, and is now trying to save face with his supporters. Well, let's talk more about this with former U.S. Ambassador to Syria and Saudi Arabia, Richard Murphy, who's worked in the region for more than 30 years. He's also the director of the American-Iran Council. Sir, thank you very much for joining us. Do you support these new sanctions on Iran?
Well, sanctions are always a weapon of choice when one's government is not prepared to go to a military confrontation. It's a way of exerting pressure on another government. Sometimes they're effective, sometimes they're not. The new sanctions were designed to apply to a number of individuals connected with Iran's Quds force, and to make any transactions involving them illegal under American law. And that is because they were identified as supporting terrorism in various countries.
So this sounds very much to me, given that it was a day after the United States had actually said that Iran is not cheating on the nuclear deal, that it is complying when it comes to the nuclear deal. It sounds as if the Trump administration would have loved to actually reveal that the Iranians were cheating on the deal, but they couldn't find much on them. So just a day later, they decided to sanction them for other stuff. Is that how it's done politically?
Well, yeah, that's a fair interpretation, but do recall that when President Obama was in charge, there was a similar imposition of sanctions virtually the same day as when the agreement on the nuclear issues came into effect. So it's been a constant in American policy to keep pressure on issues which are not connected with the nuclear.
Interesting that if we go back 2 years, when we look at the opposition to the Iranian nuclear deal, on the one hand, you had people saying that Iran wants to develop nuclear weapons and will develop nuclear weapons if this deal goes through. That was the one side of the criticism. There was another side to the criticism which said that if you free up all this money to the Islamic Republic of Iran, $100 billion or so dollars, then they will conduct empire building in the region and they will start to meddle more and try to impose themselves in the region much, much more. With that in mind, are the sanctions directly connected to the nuclear deal? Because the sanctions seem to be suggesting that this is a slap on the wrist to Iran for what it's doing in the region, and it's not about developing nuclear weapons.
No, I think that's fair. It concerns Iranian activities in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in support of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza. So it's a whole array of Iranian activities which are being targeted.
As a former ambassador, do you sympathize with the Iranian response when the foreign minister Zarif says the sanctions poison the atmosphere and violate the spirit of the nuclear agreement? Because in context, here's a country that was a kind of sworn enemy of the United States for the best part of 40 years. 2 years ago, there's a landmark deal. Things are moving in the right direction. And now the Iranians are saying, what are you doing? You're poisoning the atmosphere. Do you sympathize with that perspective?
I understand their point, but our analysts have looked at this whole array of Iranian activities. No problem with what they've done thus far in observing the nuclear accord, but that their activities are destabilizing in the region. And actually, Foreign Minister Zarif, I think, has gone beyond saying it's against the spirit. He said it's against the letter of the accord that we are opposing business investments in Iran. But these are separate issues.
Ambassador Murphy, are we seeing the region being dictated now by Saudi Arabia? And there's an interpretation saying that because of President Trump's naivety, because he might not have come into it with the same sort of level of depth of knowledge as someone like former President Barack Obama, that the Saudis are playing him. And the Saudis are using the US president to get what they want in the region, whether it's vis-a-vis Iran or even Qatar and that crisis. Is that fair?
Well, that's fair up to a point. Although President Trump, not so far back in time, was very critical of Saudi Arabia as well. He apparently was persuaded during his visit to Riyadh last month that the Saudis were conducting a very strong anti-terror campaign, and that a number of countries agreed in accusing Qatar of supporting international terrorism. That's still being debated, and attempts at mediation have been made. But it's a confused picture, and the president has changed his approach, although consistently anti-terror. He's changed his approach in picking out the particular actors.
Ambassador Richard Murphy, it's been good to talk to you again. Thanks so much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.